Spike hurried down the empty streets of Ponyville, the twilight soon turning into night as time passed. Before too long, the town would be shrouded in darkness. He had to get back to the library before then, because Twilight was depending on him, and he couldn't let her down. He dragged along his supplies, the heavy burden slowing him down more than he felt comfortable with. If he didn't hurry, then he'd be stuck alone in the streets at nightfall. This thought alone made him pick up the pace. Spike ducked under windows and skirted alleyways, always remaining hidden in the shadows that any passing building offered. Not like they were very effective anyhow. He was sweating profusely now, the added weight he was tugging along almost too much to bear. He knew it was risky, towing this much along, but the benefit was just too great to pass up, so he just gritted his teeth harder and pulled with all his might as he ran down one last alley. When the Golden Oaks Library came into view, after he rounded the last corner of an alleyway, Spike breathed a sigh of relief. He made double the effort to reach the front doors, foregoing all considerations to stick to the shadows and making a hasty run to shelter. He didn't stop pumping his legs until he felt the doorknob in his grasp. Quickly opening the door and throwing what he had lugged on his trip inside, Spike slammed the door closed and started the tedious process of fastening the multiple locks and bolts attached to the front door until the only entrance to the library was shut tight. He made double sure in keeping everything locked shut by going to the windows and pulling at the wooden boards he had nailed over them, assuring himself they would hold. Done with the necessary checks, Spike wiped off some sweat and relaxed in the dim interior of the library. The last rays of light from outside, shining in between pieces of the boards nailed to the windows, were quickly dying down, and in only a minute's time, the library had descended into complete darkness. He still managed to navigate around the room correctly, and went to where he had last deposited what he had been dragging through town. Picking up the sack, Spike left the other object he had brought along from his trip where it lay. A little damage, but not like it mattered. He'd show it to Twilight later, and he was sure she'd love it. Throwing the sack over his shoulder, Spike made his way to the library's basement doors, taking several deep breaths before unlocking it. He opened the door and took his first step into the darkness. The air hung heavy, with a musky odour that made the pores sweat on contact. The smell permeated throughout like a tidal wave, filling the small room with its rotten scent and drowning out all others. At the top of the stairs it wasn't so bad. A sweet, sickly smell, almost like fruit that's been left out in the sun for too long. But as Spike descended deeper into the dark interior of the room, the smell would overpower him with disgust. The very air he breathed stank and vicious, so much so, it felt as if it was trying to choke him in its hold. Spike walked down these steps without much trouble, however. He had grown used to them. That's the only thing you can do in such a place. The wooden creak of each floorboard being stepped upon echoed in the small vicinity of the basement. Only when he made his final step on the ground floor did the room bask in its usual silence once more. Except for one thing, however. Spike had awoken her. He knew she did not sleep, but his presence had alerted her of him nonetheless. He could already hear the chains click and clank across the stone floor as she tried feebly to get up, get to the bars of her cage, escape at any cost. Only she never could escape, and would only fall weakly to the floor once her shackles prevented her from moving forward much further. Spike walked closer to her, not one light in the room offering any semblance of sight. But like the smell, he had grown used to this, and had come prepared. A flame from his breath and candle were all he needed to offer sight to himself once more. Whether this affected her at all, he still didn't know. The dim lighting from the candle only provided sight by a couple of feet, with the rest of the basement lost to black. Setting the candle near the bars of the cage, he approached the door. The jingle of keys, followed by several failed attempts at opening the lock, were finally met with success as the door opened.
"Twilight, I'm home!"
Spike called out from the doorway of the cell. The darkness seemed to be alive, shuffling and dragging itself forward to get closer to the light, or Spike for that matter. Spike pulled back the hood of his cloak, his unwashed face covered in so many bruises and scrapes that one wouldn't be able to tell what colour his scales once were. Taking several steps closer, Spike asked,
Hey, Twilight, are you feeling tired again? You can't be lazy at a time like this.
The darkness was a predator, and it pounced for the kill. Spike fell on his backside, narrowly avoiding the wet chomp of broken teeth where his face once was. Backing up on his claws and knees, Spike put a dozen feet of distance between him and Twilight, who was unable to reach the cage's door.
Sheesh, Twilight, no need to snap at me like that.
Spike chuckled, picking himself up and dusting off his filthy cloak. Twilight's only reply was a snarl.
I already know how testy you can be with getting called lazy. It's a joke, lighten up a bit.
Spike shook his head, shivering.
Also, stop making that noise. It's super creepy.
Spike ran over to where the wax candle lay, picking up the sack he set beside it. Opening it up, Spike licked his lips and said,
We sure have something good to eat tonight. It's a bit cold since the stove doesn't work anymore. But you won't mind, will you, Twilight?
Twilight moaned, more slobber dripping on the floor.
Oh, sounds like you're already hungry.
Spike dug into the sack and pulled out a slightly bruised apple.
I found this in one of Applejack's old carts down in the city square. She must have left it there when it started. Lots of rotten ones, but hey, this one's pretty good. Oh, and hey!
He withdrew a dandelion sandwich, the bread only somewhat covered in mould. Picking the worst of the green parts off, Spike threw both the apple and the sandwich into the cage.
I got you this treat as well. Let's see how you enjoy them.
The apple rolled down the interior of the cage, being lost before it could faintly be heard hitting the bars on the other side. The dandelion sandwich slid on the floor of the cage, half illuminated in light and half shrouded in darkness before it stopped.
Twilight, come on, eat the sandwich.
Spike called out, after several seconds had passed with the sandwich being untouched. Twilight only breathed heavier, the occasional drip of slobber being the only noises she made.
I've tried to make you eat everything, but you just don't want to. How are you going to get better if you don't eat?
A low moan pierced the basement like a chilling draught. The chains clinked closer now, dragging along the floor as the wet plop of hoofballs followed it.
That's right, come on, it's your favorite,
Spike said, peeking his head out from the edge of the cage's door to glimpse the sandwich.
It's not even that stale, I swear.
The shadows condensed into a single body, heaving each breath with great effort. A hoof appeared into the dim lighting. It was hard to tell the original colour of the coat the hoof was covered in, though patches of purple could still be seen past the blistering skin and exposed muscle. The entire appendage was discoloured to a greyish hue, with an extra touch of green from some mould or rotting on the skin. The decomposing hoof squished down on the sandwich, juices from either the food item or limb dripping onto the floor. Soon enough, the rest of Twilight followed suit. Spike smiled when she finally appeared in the light. Much like her hoof, Twilight was a walking cadaver of her former self. Most of the right side of her face was a mess of boils, rotten flesh, and a broken skull, where the vile blackness of her exposed brain could be seen. Most of her mane had already fallen out, along with her right eyeball and most of her jawline. The entire right side of her cutie mark had been ripped off, teeth still sticking out of the skin. Other than that, what flesh hadn't been chewed off remained barely sticking to her bones. Most parts of her were rotten and mucky. Even her wings, once preened and groomed each and every day, were barely sticking onto her sides, defeathered and rotting, just like the rest of her. Twilight opened her mouth, the maw of broken teeth and blackened gums making an unintelligible sound from the back of her throat.
Sorry, no mustard this time,
Spike explained, returning to his bag.
And before you ask, yes, it does have mayonnaise. I know you hate that stuff, but you can just wipe it off, right?
She took a stumbling step forward and moaned louder, a brownish-red liquid dripping from her teeth, while even more fluids of various colours seeped from other parts of her body, most in areas with the worst rot damage.
Oh, come on, Twilight. It's hard finding that food.
Spike pulled a dingy ruby from the sack and popped it in his mouth, munching on it without even tasting it as he gulped it down his throat and pulled out others. Chewing on a mouthful of rubies, Spike muttered,
You don't eat anything I get you. How do you expect to get better if you don't eat?
Twilight hurled herself forward, but the chains attached to her hooves only made her jump end in her face, planting itself firmly on the floor. Upon closer inspection, there were no shackles fastened to her hooves. Instead, heavy metal spikes rammed through the bone of her forelegs and back legs where the chains were secured to.
Twilight, I know you want to hug me, but it's not safe,
Spike said, hesitantly approaching closer to the downed mare.
You're sick right now, Twilight. Everyone is. But soon, everyone will be cured, and we'll all be happy again, just like before. But for right now, you have to stay locked up. That's why you have the chains on, remember?
She looked up at Spike, a strange, volatile fluid leaking out of her empty eye socket and into her unhinged jaw. A hiss escaped her ruined lips, her mouth aimlessly chomping the air.
Twilight, please, eat the sandwich. You have to eat something.
She pulled at her chains, each jerk causing the spikes wedged into her legs to pull her back tight. Like a newborn, Twilight crawled forward, but each time was halted by her bindings. Spike stopped eating. The sandwich he had gotten Twilight was now a mess, covered in sickly fluids and bits of Twilight's skin and mane, completely unappetizing. Tapping his chin, Spike snapped his fingers and smiled widely.
Oh hey, I know what will cheer you up enough to eat some food. Guess who I bumped into the market today?
The obvious reply from Twilight was a rattling hiss that fizzled into bubbling mucus and blood pouring from her lips.
Nope, come on, Twilight, guess again.
Spike snickered under his breath as Twilight continued to wheeze and hack and moan as if her lungs were filled with an ocean of decomposing fluids. Holding a hand to his face to hold back his giggles, Spike said,
Okay, no need to get testy. I was just going to say I bumped into Rainbow Dash earlier today. She's been so busy we haven't seen her in forever. But she decided to visit today. Wait right here, I'll go get her.
Spike ran up the stairs and closed the basement door behind him with a loud thud, leaving Twilight alone with just the darkness and the candle's flame to keep her company. Not for long, however, since the door opened back up, followed by a heavy object being hurled down the stairs. Every thud and crash in its journey had a wet smack attached to it, like the object was filled with liquids. Climbing down the last step, Spike shook off some questionable spillage his foot had been coated in.
Well, that wasn't the best of ideas,
he said, dusting off his cloak.
But Dash, don't struggle so much next time, okay?
Rainbow Dash attempted to turn over, but much like a turtle flipped on its back, she just couldn't get back up. She bit haplessly at the air, her eyes reduced to nothing but dark orbs that cried a horrid black liquid. Grabbing Rainbow's tail, Spike tugged her along to the cage, various entrails following behind her. Reaching the door, Spike heaved her inside, taking haste to latch the door shut.
CRD? That wasn't so bad, right?
Spike asked, peering past the bars at Rainbow Dash.
You always had to be the stubborn one, but there's no need, you see. Plus, now we can hang out.
Dash twisted her neck in unnatural positions, her lower jaw barely hanging onto her face, while her tongue flapped out a foot in length from a hole in her neck. All semblance of a rainbow pattern on her mane was lost, since most of her scalp was now gone, and only the cracks and yellowness of her skull could be seen. Her wings, once her pride and joy, were nothing more but broken cartilage and torn muscle that barely resembled what they once were. Along with this, the most noticeable thing about Dash was the fact that she no longer had any legs. All 4 had been torn off from her body, broken bones sticking out from where they once were, and rotting much more profusely than the rest of her corpse.
Sorry about the trouble, Dash, but you know I had to cut off your legs so you wouldn't escape. But you don't mind, do you? Besides, once everything gets back to normal, I'm betting Twilight can reattach or even make you new legs, and wings too! Isn't that awesome?
Rainbow Dash had managed to roll on the floor of the cage, having ended up beside Twilight, who was in her path. The 2 barely noticed each other, their faces turned to only Spike as their jaws uselessly frothed and bit down on their diseased gums.
I mean, seriously, you nearly tackled me while I was at the market shopping. What were you doing there anyhow?
Rainbow Dash hopped in place, hissing as she attempted to scoot closer to Spike.
Okay, fine. If you don't want to explain it, you don't have to.
Spike turned away from the 2 and slid on his back until he was sitting against the bars. Holding the edge of his cloak, he stared at the numerous stains that covered its patchwork design, the smells of death already indistinguishable to him.
Well, if you're not going to tell me why you were at the market, I might as well. See, I needed some more items for the library, but markets were running out of food, and I needed to get my grocery list finished. So I thought maybe Applejack wouldn't mind if I took some apples. I mean, she has a ton, and I'd pay her back anyways. So I was going to Sweet Apple Acres when I just so happened to run into you.
Spike twiddled his thumbs, waiting as Twilight and Dash made their typical responses of low moans and slobber raining down on the cage's floor.
Yeah, big surprise meeting you there of all places. And boy, did you ever get the jump out of me.
Spike chuckled, shaking his head slowly.
And boy, did you ever get the jump on me. You always were good at ambushing ponies. Right out of nowhere. I mean, much longer and you would have really gotten me.
Spike looked to his sack, filled with whatever he could scavenge out in Ponyville.
Good thing I had that shovel, though.
He reached out and withdrew the digging tool, its surface slick with blood and various dents it had collected. The wooden handle had so many bite marks that it could barely hold together, with one end gone due to a missing wooden chunk.
You know, I don't even know why I carry this thing. I mean, it was useful to cut off your legs, but I think a machete would work better. It took forever and ever.
Spike hummed, twisting the shovel around in his hands as its wet surface caught the light of the candle.
Maybe there's good stuff to bury.
Spike set the shovel down, closing his eyes while resting his hand against the coldness of the bars. The nauseating smell, the low illumination, the sounds of moans and wheezes, and the constant drip, 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 all covered him in their sickly embrace. He accepted it.
I wonder if I go to Sweet Apple Acres tomorrow, I'll find Applejack.
He licked his lips with his long reptilian tongue.
Maybe her or Grady Smith can make me some sweet apple fritters. I can bring some back for you guys, too. Twilight, would you eat that?
Spike turned around to catch a peek at Twilight, who was currently biting on her chains while getting her broken teeth stuck on them.
Yeah, I bet you would. Maybe I could bring Applejack over to visit. She's even more stubborn than you, Dash, so that'd be a toughie. I'd probably have to go later in the day, in case she's busy with chores.
Spike chuckled mildly, wiping his nose with the back of his hand.
Might have to take more of her than just her legs. If I want to get her here, that's for sure.
Yawning while stretching out, Spike smacked his lips a few times and scratched the side of his cheek. He felt the first telltale signs of exhaustion seeping into his bones and muscles, mostly from all the work he'd been doing late at night. If Twilight found out, he'd be forced to follow a curfew for sure.
I wonder if I can get Fluttershy, too. Shame she lives so far away from town, right next to the ever-free forest, no less. But I think I can manage getting her back here if I prepare. Make a bag lunch or something. I could probably have tea at her cottage too.
Spike pouted, rubbing the end of his chin with a claw.
But how do I get her back here?
Spike waved his claw and giggled.
That's future Spike's problem, not mine.
He shuddered, putting a finger to his temple and wincing.
Oh jeez, I just remembered that. Remember how much of a bad brain freeze I got from that, Twilight?
Twilight's only rebuttal was a ferocious snap in Spike's general direction, though like all the other times he paid it no mind.
Man, that was a wild time, right? I couldn't even look at ice cream for an entire week after that. Didn't help Pinky loaded me up with enough sugar to bake 5 cakes out of.
Spike remained silent for several moments, looking deeply into the flame of the candle as it flicked, the candle wax nearly half reduced now.
I wonder if I can find Pinky, too.
A thud, followed by an unpleasant sound of bone grinding against the floor of the cage, came after Spike's statement, probably from Rainbow Dash again.
I mean, I'm pretty sure she's at Sugar Cube Corner still, but I haven't seen her in forever, or rather, any pony there actually. It's strange. Just about any pony there just up and disappeared a few weeks ago. Just when every pony was getting sick. I think Pinky was the first in that part of town to get sick. Weird, right?
After several seconds of heavily implied awkward silence, Spike shrugged.
Oh well, I'm sure I can find her eventually. Then we can get the gang back together. Maybe have a picnic too. How does that sound, you guys?
Hallowing moans were the only sounds Twilight and Dash produced. Exposed organs from Rainbow Dash's ripped open stomach were tangling themselves with Twilight's chains, though neither seemed to mind.
What? No, I'm not forgetting any pony.
Spike objected, counting his fingers one by one.
I already have you, Rainbow Dash, then I'll get Applejack and Fluttershy and finally Pinky. That's every pony.
Another moan from Twilight was let loose. Spike gritted his teeth and smashed the back of his head against the bars.
Okay, fine. I know. I forgot Rarity. You don't have to remind me every 5 seconds.
Spike held his head in his claws, eyes tight shut.
I can't find her, okay? I tried looking everywhere, but I can't find her.
Twilight, along with Dash, replied with hoarse breaths and rasps, their moans echoing in the small circumference of the basement.
Her house.
Spike gulped, feeling wetness on his palms.
Her house. Everything is burned to the ground. Nothing but ashes left. That's why I can't find her, okay?
Spike wiped at his eyes, the tears the first thing to wash away his face with in a long time.
I searched and searched. I searched and searched and searched, but nothing. It was just when every pony was getting sick and I wanted to make sure Rarity was alright. I didn't want her to get sick is all.
He was having trouble breathing, the vile fumes from Twilight and Dash's living corpses filling his lungs. Spike attempted to use his cloak to cover his mouth and nose, but only succeeded in replacing the scents of the room with the even more deplorable smell of his cloak.
The fire burned everything down. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. I couldn't find her. I just wanted to make sure she wasn't sick. That's all I wanted. Not her, not you guys, not anyone. I didn't want any of you to be sick. Not Rarity. Not sick like every pony else.
Spike shuddered as he took a big gulp of reeking air that filled his lungs with its vile breath.
I wanted to be sure she wasn't sick, and now I can't find her. Maybe she's somewhere safe, right guys?
As Spike grabbed a hold of a bar to heave himself back to his feet and turned back to the bars, he noticed Rainbow Dash was directly before him. She had been crawling and sliding on her own decayed bodily fluids to reach him, using what little remained of her broken-off legs to inch herself closer. And now that Spike was directly in front of her, right next to the bars, she took her chance. Rainbow Dash used what little remained of her legs and pushed forward, her teeth scraping along Spike's fingers holding onto the bar. Spike was quick to release his hold and fall back, screaming loudly as blood poured out of the skin of his fingers.
Dash, you bit me! You're not supposed to bite me or else I'll get sick too!
He was desperately trying to stop the bleeding from his fingers, squeezing the wound and screaming even louder as the pain increased.
I don't want to get sick. I don't want to. I don't want to. And it's all your fault, Dash.
Using his elbow, Spike pulled his leg underneath him and unsteadily got back to his feet. He stumbled towards the sack, blood dripping on the floor of the basement in a constant drip, drip, drip. He wrapped his cloak around his hand, digging through the sack and throwing out items and random junk.
I can't believe this happened again. I was careful with everything. But not now. I slipped up. I could get sick. Then who will take care of Twilight and everyone else? Who?
Spike stopped when he finally got the object he desired. He withdrew a knife, a typical butter knife that had its edge sharpened. Shaking, Spike pulled away his cloak and revealed the back of his fingers, covered in blood and the black residue that came from Dash's mouth. He held the tip of the knife over his index finger, both his hands shaking so hard he could barely get it level. He turned back to Twilight and Rainbow Dash. Twilight was still stuck in her chains, clouded in darkness, as the candle burned lower and lower, nearly put out, while Dash frothed and moaned as her head hit uselessly against the bars.
Dash, I'm sorry for yelling. You didn't mean to. You're just sick, like everyone else. Except for me. I can't be sick because I need to take care of you guys.
Taking in a deep breath, Spike winced, the knife tearing into his flesh and grinding against the bone. Stopping for a moment, he noticed the flame was dying out, the entire candle now melted wax. As the light finally gave out, he chuckled.
Hey guys, I think I might know something you'll finally want to eat.